everyone. Hello, Rochester. Welcome to the Equity Alliance Equity Series. My name is Wafal Khalifa, and I work for Destination Medical Center as the Equitable Development Coordinator. Before we begin our topic for today's episode, I would like to take you on some background and some information about the Equity Alliance and why we are launching this collaborative. So what is the Equity Alliance? We're hoping that our purpose is to accelerate equitable change and impact disparities through reparation, restoration, reformation, based in radical collaboration. Our initiatives, we would like to focus through the Equity Alliance into creating pathways for democratic participation for underrepresented communities, underserved communities. And Rochester has been familiar so far with community co-design, which has been very amazing engagement tool that we have utilized in so many projects. So we would like to utilize community co-design and include it in our initiatives, along with building coalition among organizations in Rochester in order to create a space for shared best practices and how we can learn from each other's experiences in other communities, regionally, nationally, or from around the world to improve our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And lastly, we would like to work on equitable policy transformation. We do realize that we do have a lot of disparities in our community in health, transportation, education, economy, workforce, and wealth for sure. And in order to see some changes, we do need to improve a lot of our work through making changes in our policies and transform the policies to be able to create more vibrant, diverse, equitable, and inclusive community in Rochester. Our methodology is we're committing to create healthier Rochester where everyone participates equitably in the design of public policy. Our purpose and goals are to deliver equitable outcomes, all people at a time. We did create over the past year and a half some short-term goals and long-term goals as we were sharing with different organizations and different DI practitioners in our community, our initiative of creating the Equity Alliance. And the short-term goals that we created is to create an implementation plan for the initiatives that I've mentioned earlier. And one of the initiatives is to create a shared space to share best practices in a DEI sector. And this is why we're launching the Equity Series today in the hopes of creating a space where we can learn from each other and learn from other communities and learn about new concepts and what worked and what is successful in order to create that common knowledge and shared definitions about DEI. Build a foundation, internal work to support the development of a community plan that is responsive and allows new members to contribute, and then also create shared DEI language and definitions. These are some of the short-term goals that we have discussed so far between Destination Medical Center and City of Rochester, and we hope that we would see more organizations in Rochester to join us so we can create our long-term plan, which is creating a community DEI plan. We totally understand that each organization plays a part in removing these disparities that we have in our community, and why not do it all together in a coalition and in a partnership. And I want to share with all of you, and as you're going to share information that you'll hear today in this Equity Series with your organizations, your leaders, that the Equity Alliance is open for all the organizations that we have community organizations that we have in Rochester. And we welcome you to join the Equity Alliance and to help us with preparing content for the Equity Series, create training and common understanding of DEI initiatives. Feel free to contact me, Wafa Al Khalifa at dmc.org, or contact my colleague who you will see in this series, Chow Matala. She is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director for City of Rochester. I don't want to take so much time from the main purpose of the presentation today, and we wanted to launch this series with a very important topic. We were introduced not too long ago to Sarah McKinley, and Sarah is the Community Wealth Building Programs, the Director of Community Wealth Building Programs at the Democracy Collaborative. And we learned, some really interesting information about this concept, and we did not want to hold that to ourselves. And that's why we wanted to launch the Equity Series in order to share some cool concepts that we hear from all around the world to create a better understanding and in the hopes of making Rochester a better place. So I would like to welcome Sarah for taking the this very challenging mission of being our first presenter for this series today. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Wafa. No pressure there.
No pressure.
No pressure. Thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. And I'm going to start, this will be a good sign, by sharing my screen. And if I can do that properly, then we're all off to a great start. So bear with me, everyone, while I do that. Make sure I share the right thing.
And while you're doing that, Sarah, and I just want to share with our attendees today and our audience, feel free to share your questions and concerns or comments. I'll make sure that I read your questions to Sarah during or after she completes her presentation. So feel free to utilize that chat function, and I'll be watching that.
Yes, thank you. Please do. I do hope that we have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A afterwards. Thank you for that kind introduction, Wafa. It's a real honor to be here with you, to partners in Rochester, and to be kicking off this excellent new series on equity across Rochester. And oops, there I am. To learn, I hope we have the opportunity for me to learn more about the work that's happening in Rochester, because there is, as far as I understand it from Wafa and team, there's a lot of opportunity, many assets, and a wealth within the community in the broadest sense, not least of which in its rich diversity and rich institutions and community-based organizations. So excited to learn more about that. But without further ado, I'll speak a little bit about who I am. Wafa mentioned that I'm Director of Community Wealth Building Programs for the Democracy Collaborative. The Democracy Collaborative is a think tank. We're based in DC, but we work in the US and transatlantically with partners in city governments, institutions, community-based organizations, and movement groups to advance models, research, and demonstration projects for a more equitable and democratic economy. So how to build a local economy that is centered on equity, inclusion, and shared prosperity for all. And that is our focus. And why are we focusing on democratizing the economy, building a more equitable economy by design? I think most of you will know that we have a problem of growing wealth and economic inequality, not just in the US, but globally. At the moment, you'll see here on the left there, left on my screen, the richest 1% globally own 46% of the world's wealth. And as you can see, that the concentrations of wealth are very highly disproportionate to the concentrations of population. And in fact, in the United States, this is an even more exaggerated statistic where 3 men specifically, own more than 49% of the wealth of the country, which is more than the wealth of 160 million people in aggregate. So really large inequalities, large and disproportionate concentrations of wealth that we've actually never seen in recorded history. And in fact, the benefits from that wealth are not actually trickling down, as we have often been told that they are. They are not rising all boats. In fact, most of the statistics point to that the wealthy are their health statistics are increasing, their lifespans are increasing, and for the rest of us, most of those statistics are either maintaining and in some instances starting to decline as well. So you're seeing actually the gap, not just in wealth, but also in health outcomes and well-being outcomes. And of course, I don't need to tell this audience that our economic and social conditions are some of the largest determinants of ill health that there are. In fact, significantly more than access to care or quality of care and even healthy behaviors. Your social and economic conditions such as education, employment, income, community stability, other statistics of poverty, such as access to food and things of that nature, are what determine health. And of course, in the US, this is often geographically located because of histories of segregation and concentration of poor, generally BIPOC communities into areas that have less access and usually environmentally degraded conditions as well. As you see on this map, here is New Orleans, and in the span of a few miles, you have life expectancy gaps of 25 years in age. I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that this statistic over here in Lakeview, where the life expectancy is 80, that's a fairly affluent, largely white Caucasian community, whereas here in Iberville, next to the French Quarter, down in downtown historic New Orleans, there's a life expectancy of 55 years of age, which is shocking, frankly. And of course, that neighborhood is a largely African-American community with entrenched issues of poverty, disinvestment, and disenfranchisement. So clear parallels between social conditions, locational conditions, environmental conditions, economic access, and good health. But of course, this inequality doesn't only impact health, it impacts all aspects of our society. Of course, connected to health, of course, is things like stress and anxiety, which is directly connected to economic conditions and the ability to provide for yourself, to support your families, to have stability and resilience, especially at a time of crisis, which of course we are in. But and of course, economic inequality heightens crisis instability, financial crisis, debt, inflation, all of these things disproportionately impact the lowest income of us, those who do not have economic security. And of course, the results are lots of social ills, for higher violent crime, property crime, less social mobility, lower educational performances, and of course, what we're really starting to see more and more is a breakdown in trust, a breakdown in the connective tissue of not only our communities, but our institutions, our government, and elsewhere, which leads to polarization and social disruption. So really, these economic inequalities have domino effects in all aspects of our life. So what can we do about that? Why, it seems like such an overwhelming series of interconnected and complex challenges. But in fact, what we are talking about actually is economic design and economic structure that underpins our society. And of course, this is something that we as people create, as societies create the conditions. So how can we recreate them? How can we rewire the conditions of our economy so that instead of producing some of these more pernicious inequalities, they start to produce benefit by its natural functioning. So looking at centering equity, centering well-being, centering good health in our economy, and designing the institutions of our economy around that. And we do that through what we call community wealth building. So community wealth building is an economic development model, a way of building local economies that is rooted in direct community ownership and control of assets in place. There are lots of statistics that show that economic participation, people who have a sense of economic self-determination and ability to control and manage and benefit from their economic conditions, have greater outcomes in terms of stability, resilience, well-being, and good health. And of course, we are looking at community wealth building as a tool, a strategy, an approach that builds equitable and sustainable economies by design. So like I said in the previous slide on economic plumbing, building in equity and sustainability directly into the design of economic institutions in place and the ownership of assets that create wealth. So what do I mean when I talk about assets and wealth? So we're talking about looking across the whole of society, of a local economy, and looking at all of the assets broadly within that local economy, and then asking the question of how can we broaden ownership of those assets so that the wealth that they create benefits more people. Traditionally, in our current economic arrangement, with private ownership being the paramount way of owning economic institutions, most of the value that is generated from that ownership goes to the owners. And of course, that is based often on histories of exclusion and inequalities, and also, of course, those who had access to these ownership opportunities over those who did not. So how can we broaden those ownership opportunities in a way that more people can benefit from the wealth that they generate? So for example, we talk about, these are what we call the 5 pillars of community wealth building, the 5 pillars of a local economy that generate wealth, and how we can think of them in broader terms. So progressive procurement is a key aspect of that. Thinking of our spending flows in a community, the way that a community, through its local institutions, its governments, and otherwise purchases goods and services, and where that money is going and to whom. How can we broaden access to those spending flows in a way that is more democratic, more transparent, and more accountable? Just use of land and property. Land is one of the largest wealth generating assets in most of our economies. And of course, that can be in the form of housing, that can be in the form of commercial real estate, that can be in the form of other things as well. But how can we actually think of those assets as community benefiting? And how can we think of their value beyond just creating wealth for a few, but for creating value for all of us, broader ways of not only owning the land, but stewarding land so that it is producing more collective value in different ways. Fair work. Our labor is a huge asset. All the work that we do creates a massive amount of value in our communities. How can we think of our labor in broader terms so that we can actually benefit from the wealth that we are producing through our work in more collective ways, and make sure that that wealth, that work is fair, is family supporting, and is able to really create decent conditions for people in the workplace. Inclusive and democratic ownership of enterprise. So thinking of enterprise ownership more broadly, looking at different forms of enterprises, from social enterprises all the way up to worker-owned cooperatives and municipally owned public enterprise. Thinking of how that benefits the wealth from these enterprises can go back to the workers and the people who are partaking in that enterprise activity in the first place, and rooting those forms of wealth locally. And then finally, locally rooted finance, which of course helps to recirculate all of this wealth in meaningful ways so that it stays in the community, so that it doesn't get extracted from the community. It isn't, and it is recirculating to the benefit of the people who produce the wealth in the first place. So looking at community development finance institutions, credit unions, and other forms of collective capital management that are really investing in the real economy in place, really actually putting back into the growth of the kinds of institutions that we're talking about and meeting the needs of local residents in place. So the good news about all of these, across all of these 5 pillars, is there's tons of activity in all of them, in every community, in the US, transatlantically, and globally. In every one of these 5 pillars, there are different ways of really building in economic participation, economic self-determination, and broad ownership of assets in place. You'll be familiar with many of them. There are many of these assets already in Rochester and surrounding communities. I'm going to go through each of these pillars and just highlight some of these examples of the kind of activity that would be considered community wealth building activity that focuses on broadening ownership and rooting wealth locally. So in fair work, for example, there are all sorts of activities to create pipelines to good employment that match employer need to training programs, for example, that then provide stairways for employees as they enter the workforce to build skills and move forward, to have supports within their workplace. And then there are all sorts of initiatives that create things like living wage commitments, good work charters that enable employers to actually sign on and demonstrate their commitment to creating a healthy work environment and be accountable to their employees who are working there as well, and many other ways to do this. Of course, a key part of fair work is also enabling employees to have greater participation and engagement with their employers, for example, through things like open book management or participatory budgeting or things of this nature that engage employees directly in the management of the firm as well, and help them have greater ownership and commitment to the work, which has demonstrated higher levels of well-being, higher levels of retention in the workforce, and greater satisfaction all around. In locally rooted finance, there are tons of activities in many places. You no doubt have multiple credit unions, which are cooperatively owned banking institutions in Rochester. Broadly, they're part of what are known as community development financial institutions that are actually tasked with reinvesting directly into local economies to actually produce positive benefit in those communities. CDFIs can be anything from a revolving loan fund to a credit union as well, and directly targets communities that are underserved by financial institutions that are underbanked or have low access to finance and ability. Similarly, there are new community investment vehicles that are popping up to get existing money in communities more directly invested into those communities that need it most, and looking at things such as lower returns on investment, but still being able to make good investments that might be more stable and might be more long-term, but have a lower immediate return. So looking at things like that and quantifying the social benefit that these things produce. And just to step back a little bit, the idea with all of these concepts too is to be addressing things upstream prevention of social challenges, so that you're not having to do downstream remediation of the outcomes of inequality. So a lot of this is built in to actually, in many ways, not only improve conditions and create better communities and more healthy communities, but also to actually use the resources that we have more effectively, so that we're not having to actually spend those resources and have high costs of addressing the impacts of ill health downstream, when it's already much more challenging and much more difficult to remediate. Pillar 3, just use of land and property. As I said before, land is a huge wealth generating asset. How can we think of it in more productive, more community rooted kinds of uses? There are many different forms of owning land collectively, such as community land trusts, community land banking, which aggregates derelict land and puts it back into productive use, community buyouts of land, again, that isn't being productively used or isn't serving a community purpose, things like community gardens and green spaces that start to do carbon capture and things of that nature, to reclaim some of that land that isn't being productively managed and is actually causing health problems and social issues as well. So, and then of course, how to use that to create greater affordability, long-term affordability, and stability in homes, so that people aren't displaced as markets fluctuate. So community land trusts, I mentioned that as well. Cooperative housing, limited liability cooperatives, things of that nature are growing in response to this, in addition to community buyouts and so forth. Finally, inclusive and democratic enterprise ownership. I mentioned already that there's a spectrum of different enterprise ownership forms. Of course, everything from a traditional small privately owned local firm to minority-owned enterprises, but then also things like social enterprises that return their profits back into fulfilling a social mission, and helping to alleviate some of the social ills that we were talking about before. Employee stock ownership plans, where employees actually own a share of their enterprise in stock and benefit from the profit or wealth that enterprise is generating. Worker-owned cooperatives, where there's direct profit sharing among the employees within that cooperative, often modeled on a more democratic process, so that those employees are also managing the functioning of that. And then, of course, municipal and publicly owned enterprises, where you're talking about the collective management of our resources, such as, for example, energy, water, transit, things of that nature, thinking of these things in enterprise forms and how to create a more democratic purpose or a democratic form around their management. There's huge growth in all of this activity across the US. Worker cooperatives in particular have been growing significantly in the last 5 to 6 years. This map actually is fairly outdated. These numbers are higher, but it's catching on as a real way for people to not only create better work environments and have profit sharing mechanisms and greater wealth distribution for people in those cooperatives, but to also provide the goods and services that many communities need locally, rather than having to get those services from elsewhere. And then finally, progressive procurement. And I'll speak to this because it ties directly into one of the key assets of a community wealth building strategy, which is local anchor institutions. So progressive procurement is really our public and institutional spending in place. So the goods and the services that large institutions and employers are procuring at all times, and how can they do so in a way that actually roots that procurement wealth more locally, so that it's generating more return on the dollar. It's not being extracted out of the community right away to shareholder profits or elsewhere with large corporations, but instead actually staying within the community and circulating to produce goods and services. There are lots of ways to do this, from having more accessible contracts put out to bid, building capacity with local contractors, local suppliers, local small business owners, but also partnering directly with new forms of enterprise to help them grow and scale to provide these services as needed in place. So why are anchor institutions such an important part of a community wealth building effort? So anchor institutions are large public nonprofit institutions that have a mission to serve, right? They're producing a good or a service in a place that is intended for the people who live there or for the community that's being created. They are not going to get up and leave. They are inherently connected to that place. Their success goes arm in arm with the success of the communities around them. They are providing the goods and services that then they also are procuring and accessing from their communities as well. And so it's a symbiotic relationship. They are vested in their communities, and they're large. In most communities across the country, anchor institutions, these kinds of institutions, are the largest employers. They are the largest purchasers of goods and services, and often they are the largest asset holders in terms of land and investment portfolios. So how can they use all of that economic infrastructure to support the growth of these kinds of community-based institutions so that their wealth is more broadly distributed across the community in a holistic way, and really can help to address these issues of inequity, lack of access, and concentrated wealth otherwise. So to give a few examples of the kinds of institutions and what they're doing concretely around this, I'll speak to a local government effort. And of course, many local governments are looking at a community wealth building a strategy to think of how their own procurement, how their own hiring, how their own land use is supporting these kinds of community-rooted institutions. So the city of Chicago, through their Office of Equity and Racial Justice, actually used a chunk of their American Rescue Plan funds to capitalize what they've called the Community Wealth Building Ecosystem Initiative. So to help create an ecosystem of support around a lot of these endeavors that already exist. The worker cooperatives, the community land trusts, the CDFIs, the credit unions. What kinds of additional supports do they need in terms of legal supports, small business development supports, financing, training, other things of that nature? The kinds of ecosystems that often exist for more traditional enterprises, for more traditional endeavors, how can they actually build up that capacity, build up the ecosystem of support around those kinds of initiatives in a meaningful way? So they created this fund. They've now started to allocate money to it, and the goal is to really start to build up, connect, and scale some of these efforts that already exist, so as to be able to demonstrate the capacity for change and help them help these initiatives be greater than the sum of their parts, if you will. Another example is of a health system. There are many examples of health systems across the country and globally that are really taking steps to use the whole of their institutional impact to create good health, looking at their economic impacts as a way of addressing, as I mentioned before, those social and economic determinants of ill health. So Gunderson Lutheran, some of you may be familiar with that health system in rural Wisconsin. They made a commitment in 2008 to go carbon neutral, and through that, they developed a whole series of commitments to not only address their carbon footprint, but to do so in a way that supported the local community. They made commitments to sourcing local foods, to sourcing local products, to building up the infrastructure around that. They set a goal of 20% local food production. They actually met that goal faster than they intended to, and actually even surpassed it. One of the reasons they were able to do that was that they helped to capitalize a multi-stakeholder cooperative that involved local farmers, local shippers, local value-added services like canning and freezing and things like that, to help aggregate some of the production so that it can actually meet the needs of the demand of that local system, that local health system, all the while providing good jobs to people in rural communities where they are serving. higher education, again, universities, colleges, large asset holders, often with endowments. How can they think about using those assets in a way that not only build the social capital in terms of education, but also the social capital of their communities in many other ways as well. The University is of Shady Grove. It's actually a collaboration, a coalition of 9 universities outside of Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County, Maryland, that came together to make a strategic commitment to using all of their economic activity in a way that builds the community and actually builds their students for the future, right? Meeting the workforce needs of the community and also their students in terms of training, in terms of creation of new enterprises, and building the wealth around that. They launched an entrepreneurship equity incubator, which was an 8-week boot camp for local entrepreneurs from BIPOC communities. They provided funding for that and then helped to launch those enterprises into the community so that they could provide the goods and services there. So these are all powerful examples that exist in communities all over, as I've said. What community wealth building really offers as a strategy, as a coherent approach to a local economy, is the interconnectivity among and between all of these activities across all 5 of the pillars of community wealth building. So how is progressive procurement supporting inclusive and democratic enterprises, which employ people to have more fair work, better work conditions, greater access to profit sharing and wealth creation? And how are they doing so in a way that uses land in appropriate ways, that puts that land into productive use for community residents, that benefits more people and doesn't separate them out and exclude them from access to land? And how is that all financed in a way that the finance that is produced, the wealth that is produced from this, is recirculating, being reinvested back into the community, and producing real outcomes in place, beginning to to displace that more extractive approach to economic growth. So one example of where all of these things have come together in a fairly interconnected way is in Cleveland, Ohio, with an effort called the Evergreen Cooperatives. It was started over 10 years ago now, with support from the Cleveland Foundation and as part of a coalition of anchor institutions as well as community-based organizations to look across their economy and figure out how to better connect the wealth of all of their institutions within the center of Cleveland. So Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Clinic, university hospitals, local government departments, museums and cultural institutions. How can they take that wealth and connect it more intentionally to most of the disinvested, disenfranchised, disengaged communities surrounding that downtown core? And how can they do so in a collaborative and intentional way that brings those communities into the design of that connection? And so they created a collaborative effort that's continuing, it's ongoing. One of the first things they did was assess sort of where the spending of these institutions were going and to whom it was benefiting, and then begin to analyze the leaks in that. Where could some of those things go locally instead? Where could some of that spending be directed locally? And how could local enterprise fill some of the gaps in the local economy? What kinds of services could new enterprises offer that weren't already being offered in the local economy, and how could they do so through a cooperative design that allows people, and particularly people who have access to entry? So in fact, these were intentionally designed to employ people returning from the prison system, coming back into the economy, how to help them with issues of recidivism, and create stable jobs where they can also share in the wealth. So they created initially 3 worker-owned cooperatives that directly provide goods and services to those anchor institutions in place. They also created a revolving loan fund working with the local CDFI that took some of the profits in addition to the profit sharing and put it back into the fund that could then recirculate, grow capacity to have more cooperatives developed, to continue to improve the services of the existing cooperatives, and also begin to build an ecosystem of supports around these organizations. So now this network employs over 400 local residents. As I said, almost a majority of them are returning citizens. They provide living wages. They receive a profit sharing annually. It can be upwards of $10,000, which is a fairly significant profit share for a lot of these families where a lot of these employees were previously, many of them were making $18,000 a year for a family of four. So really making a huge difference in the wages of these communities and helping to actually stabilize those communities and grow the economy in meaningful ways, in rooted and productive ways. And that is just one example of many. So there are many places, not just in the US, but globally. I'm most familiar with the efforts in the US, the UK, Europe, and Australasia. But no doubt there are examples all over the place. But the real goal is to connect all of this activity, to support it, to provide the infrastructure, the policy, the resource, the capacity building so that it can truly become an economic alternative that builds inequity, that addresses issues of inequality at its roots upstream, rather than having to deal with the issues of inequality downstream. So without further ado, I'll stop there. I'm happy to dig in. I feel like I've kind of rushed through this. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I know there's a lot in there. So I'd love to take questions and hear from some of your own experiences and discuss. One thing I will say is that this is a growing movement. It's iterative. These are new and experimental things, and there's new stuff coming online every day. And there's a real room for innovation, for creativity, for excitement. And I'd love to learn from what's happening in Rochester and help to support that kind of innovation for your community and tell that story to others as well. So thanks for having me, and I'll turn it back over to Wafa.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate you, sharing this presentation and giving several examples, showing examples of different institutions and organizations, which hopefully inspires some of our organizations and institutions that we have locally here, that it can be implemented. We did receive, I believe, a question in the chat here, and I'm going to read it out to you. Adapters seem to be relative large municipalities with established tradition of public-private partnerships. Do you have examples? Smaller city without strong PPP tradition to get to this model?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, we're working with a number of small cities. For example, Meadville, Pennsylvania. It's in the western end of Pennsylvania, just kind of right between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Small post-industrial town, used to be sort of tool and die manufacturing, had a lot of post-industrial flight, and as a result, really high unemployment, a lot of decaying infrastructure, and of course a reduced tax base, which made it very hard for local government to provide services and also to do things like have public-private partnerships because there really wasn't much to fill that gap. So we're working with Meadville, actually looking at some of the assets that they already have. So for example, they have a community market that's owned by the municipality. How can they use that community market as an incubator space, for example, for more social enterprises, more cooperatives that can then begin to provide goods and services not only to the local government, but also to the local college, the local health system, and things of that nature. So there are examples of smaller places doing this. We've also worked in Indian country with indigenous populations on reservations in the West. We worked with the Lakota Sioux on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where there's a real lack of institutions, as a matter of fact. And so what they were finding was that so many people not only didn't have jobs, but they also couldn't buy goods and services on the reservation. So they were leaving the reservation and no money was staying on the reservation. So they realized they needed to develop housing, they needed to develop jobs, they needed to develop services. And they came together actually through a community development agency to start building what they called a regenerative community, and using that building activity, the development of that community, to actually start to build skills on construction, for example, wastewater management, other things of that nature that they could then provide for themselves and the community more broadly as they developed more housing alternatives, more green space alternatives and things of that nature. So there are ways to create that economic activity, even if there isn't an existing infrastructure of institutions of large business activity and other things like that. It's often a larger lift, that is true, but it can be done, and there are many places that are trying that.
Thank you, Sarah. Al, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I guess I do. I'm going to be a little candid in my comment that in a city like ours, we don't have a concentrated structure that say they will recognize the need of this kind of thing, and to really gather together all these forces to form a coalition that is sustaining and also accountable, and then be able to, let me just put it that way. In our community, we started many different initiatives, including what we call the Intercultural City Initiative. There's a fantastic kickoff, typically, and that got started 3 or 4 years ago, and then it dissipated. I said it went nowhere. So I guess my question is, in your examples of all these communities that seem to have successfully embraced this methodology, where does the leadership come from? Or does it have to be driven from the bottom up? Which, by the way, I am one of those bottom up people, representing the racially marginalized groups, the BIPOC groups. And that pushing up is not easy, okay? Pushing on a string, okay? So the synchronizing with the top has been extremely challenging, I could call it that way. So what is your experience in a situation where pushing a string, and then there are all kinds of goodwill people that actually declare that they're for all this thing, and yet there is, because of either politically lack of strength or whatever it is, that got dispersed. The power structure got dispersed. There's very little ownership, except for the fact that they're nodding their head to say, "Yep, this is good stuff. We want it." And that's not enough, right? We need action. So I guess I'm expressing some frustration, as well as looking for some recommendation, or maybe from this group here, we could generate some more from the middle kind of a pushing to expand this methodology. I'll stop at that. Okay.
I mean, Al, you're putting your finger on the heart of the issue. I mean, what you're expressing is a very common challenge, unfortunately. And I will say that we see a lot of that, right? Good efforts, good initiatives, only able to get so far, and then sort of an ebb, maybe a little peak and then an ebb, and never really able to sustain itself. And then, as you say, sort of superficial, or maybe even at times rhetorical commitments to support that don't actually lead to sustained infrastructure, institutional development around that. And there is no one answer to this problem. It is going to depend on the place and the conditions of the place, and it should be tailored to your place. That said, the places where this is more successful and more sustained have a governance that supports this. And it has a governance that enables sort of community ownership while holding the institutions and the government to account. And so I'll speak to Chicago, which is fairly early stages, but I think the way that they are going about this is a really interesting and important model. Because, of course, if you know anything about Chicago, there's tons of grassroots activity. There's tons of bottom-up activity. There always has been. There's a huge and robust, movement-based body of work in Chicago, and it's been building for years, for generations, right? And this momentum really is what tipped the city to say. And then, of course, I think recent developments with Black Lives Matter and social movements really pushing issues of equity and holding institutions to account for their behavior caused the city itself to say, okay, we can't just stand on the sidelines. We have to support this work as well. What does that look like? And that's how they came to this community wealth building work. And they've had an administration change, but they still have that. They created an Office of Equity and Racial Justice within the city of Chicago. It's now become a permanent office. It is tasked with issues of economic equity. And even though I'd love to see that sort of expand into their planning and economic development departments as well, it's rooted in the city. There's staffing around it. There's agency. But they're not owning it. They've created an advisory board that is all made up of community actors, those organizations and community-based institutions that have been doing this work for some time. They have created through this new initiative a center outside of the city that is going to be run by community-based organizations in coalition that will own this agenda, that will set the goals and agenda and strategy for policy, and also provide the capacity building and supports to the organizations that are doing this work on the ground. I know it's not perfect. I know it's sort of a muddling through, but it's the beginning of a governance structure that enables both a community based sort of control mechanism and the sustained engagement of the local government to support the work over time. So we'll see, but it's places like that have that kind of structure built in, have those kinds of transparency and accountability mechanisms through community-based board and things of that nature, where I think these things will be able to be more sustained in place.
I would like to kind of modulate a little bit about what I just. Yeah. I think there is a lot of energy in our community, a lot of goodwill, including what OFA and DMC is doing. So I don't want to diminish the passion and the commitment that we have. Well, I think what might be lacking is that structure, the systematic that can really sustain this kind of effort. It make it more productive, more effective. Otherwise, we have a lot of initiatives, a lot of goodwill, a lot of energy, okay, including the one that we're here today, obviously. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that we're really committed, in terms of from a grassroots or from a community-based organization standpoint, and also from our leaders in the community as well. So it's going to the next level, I guess.
Al, I was going to mention something that I did have a question prepared for Sarah, because I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of seeing all these initiatives and all these ideas and concepts, but how can we get into implementing? And we're hoping through the Equity Alliance, and as we build this coalition, collaborating with organizations, one another, is that we hold ourselves accountable and implement together and partner through that. But I do have a question regarding today's topic to Sarah that maybe can help our organizations and everyone here in the audience today to get an idea of how can we begin this process. And I also saw a comment in the chat showing some of the work that we have done in our community, and it's Jory's comment. As you were sharing the examples, Sarah, definitely there's some examples that we have seen in our community in one way or another. But, and I appreciate you sharing the difference between what is community wealth building and what an anchor organization can provide. But since we're in the second half of the year and many organizations are preparing their work plans, their budgets for 2024, how can we take or plan for some initial steps? Are there any assessments organizations need to take or to commit to within their organization in order to prepare themselves to commit to community wealth building?
Yeah, absolutely, Wafa. And I do want to acknowledge that, I know there's a lot of great activity and energy and commitment and opportunity in Rochester. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. It also is a challenge because how do you coordinate that and where do you start and how do you connect that? So I appreciate that it's a wonderful challenge to have, but can sometimes be overwhelming. And so one place that we often say is a good place to start, and actually, Wafa, I think the timing is good for people looking at their budgets, institutions looking at budgets, is to do what we call a spend analysis, to understand where your spending is going. Again, community wealth building is about using the assets that you have. So understanding where money is going in place and to whom it is going can help you to make decisions about how to better direct it, how to get more bang for your buck, how to start to really be efficient in directing that spending flow in ways that can support and augment this kind of work, including through the kinds of infrastructure and governance supports that we were just talking about with Al, right? How can some of the money you're already spending in community be redirected in ways to support this work? And so starting with a spend analysis is a great way to do that. And there are tools to do that. Most institutions have most of this information publicly available. But it's not coherently presented, right? It's not, there's no narrative that comes out of it. So how can they take what they already know or have, but then create a clearer and coherent and more transparent story about it that can create really and paint a picture for what else can be done and how else spending flows can be directed. So that's just one way to get started as a means of not only showing sort of goodwill and transparency, but also having concrete things to react to and build strategy around.
Awesome. And I did see another question from Sarah in the chat, and it is relating to the same. So I think the way you answered does address her question. You offered some steps on how organizations can begin a path towards community wealth building. I wonder if there is any more questions or comments from the audience. I know that we're close to time, and I want to use this moment by thanking you, Sarah, for presenting and taking this challenge of being our very first presenter in launching this equity series. It's been very helpful, and I hope that the community gets excited about this concept. It was great to have you here and share all these different examples, and hopefully it inspires organizations in our community to take action. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being here with us. I wanted to share with all of you a quick story to conclude this series today. And it's just going to take me a moment. It's not going to take me just 1 minute. So this picture is my grandfather's picture, and I wanted to share it with you all. He grew up in a poor city in East Sudan, worked for an Italian merchant, and he enjoyed working for the Italian merchant when he was young because he had access to hearing the radio, BBC radio, and he was able to hear all about new ideas and new things from all around the world. One day he heard the story of the Congress forming in India. It inspired him to share the information with his religious leader in order to end the British colonization. He ended up going to the capital city, took the first train, and shared it with his religious leader. His religious leader then took him over to a meeting where he met with all the people that you see in the picture. It was a room full of politicians, leaders from different communities and different organizations who ended up creating the Graduates Congress in Sudan, which led the work into ending the British colonization in Sudan in 1956. And my grandfather ended up witnessing this historic moment, standing behind his religious leader. What we shared with you today could be similar to what he heard maybe in the radio or what you would hear in a podcast or through television and different media platforms. But it's up to you to change the way that you react to what you're hearing through these different platforms by not only being an advocate and to become maybe a part of the group that would take an action in order to create more vibrant, more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive community in Rochester that belongs to all of us, one person at a time. I thank you all for joining us today, and I hope that we get to see you next month on August 23rd for a new episode and a new topic. See you next month.